This one. This one. It's okay. Yes. But first, we have to put on the camera and the audio. We are ready?
No, it's tutto.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
Excellent.
Great.
Y le paso a Sandra y a
Does anyone want to check that the audience is seeing what can you check the audience? Yeah.
Let's check. I will connect myself. Sandra, Emilio. Al lado mande el link al Zoom, ¿sí? A Vero.
Acá, no, mira, yo tengo un vasito, así no usamos otro.
Okay, perfect. It's working fine. Look, it's okay. So we are ready.
Okay?
Yes, everything is okay. We can start.
We've run all our tests and we're ready. Ça va? Ça va? Ça marche?
C'est très modernité. ¿Quién quiere esto que tengo? Que es muy buena, ¿no? Porque chupa el ruido.
And we're okay with our interpreters? We're okay?
Yes.
That's good.
Wait a minute, because we are not, but I don't find the interpretation here. Yes. En los tres puntitos, para los que están ahí. I would say it in Spanish.
Sí.
Para quienes están conectados por Zoom, si necesitan traducción simultánea, tienen que buscar la opción intérprete en el Zoom. La mía estaba dentro de tres puntitos, tocas los tres puntitos y la de arriba del todo dice interpretación. Y ahí seleccionan el canal español, entiendo.
Sí.
Y ahí van a poder escuchar. Cualquier cosa me pueden escribir por el chat que estoy conectada y tratamos de ayudarlos.
And they see me on the Zoom as well.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that makes it a little bit more entertaining.
A ver, yo
Sí,
tratar a ver si le
wait.
engancha esto para los auriculares de ella. Bueno, vamos a comenzar. Yo voy a ir al lado de Adrián para presentarlo. Ahora sí. Bueno, es una presentación bilingüe. Espera que me muevo ahí. Buenas tardes, estamos en el Instituto Gino Germani.
We're at the Gino Germani Institute.
She's doing claro, tenemos que bajar perdón, hay que bajar el volumen para que no salga el ruido por acá. Hay que sacar el ruido, o sea, hay que sacar de acá el volumen. Perdón, seguimos ajustando cosas. Muy bien. Bueno, vamos a ver si ahora sí.
Okay,
Bueno,
let's see if it's working now.
Estamos en el Instituto
Good
Gino
afternoon.
Germani. Es
We
una
are at the Gino
actividad
Germani
que
Institute.
organizamos en el
This is
marco
an
de
activity
un
that we
proyecto
have
que
organized within the framework of a
ganamos hace un
project
tiempo con Adrián y que empezó en enero
that we won
de este año.
a while ago with Adrian,
4.
and we began in January 2024.
La parte donde acá. Y bueno, estamos haciendo la prueba
And
de hacer traducción
we
simultánea.
are trying
La
to
idea era que
do
Adrián se sienta
simultaneous
cómodo
translation. The
porque
idea
va a
is for
exponer
Adrian to feel
ideas
comfortable
complejas
because
que
he's
tienen
going
que
to be
ver con
exposing
la
very
base
complex
teórica y los
ideas that have to do
fundamentos
with the
de este
theoretical
proyecto
foundation
que tenemos. Adrián lo
of this
presento, es
project.
profesor
I will introduce
en
Adrian
teoría
now.
social
He
y
is
política
a
y director del
professor of
Laboratorio de
social and
Humanidades
political
Radicales de la
theory, and
Universidad
he
de
is
Cork
director
en
of the Radical
Irlanda.
Humanities Laboratory in
Dirigió
the
por muchos
Cork
años el
University
Instituto
College,
Bauman en el
Ireland.
marco
He
de la
directed the
Universidad de
Bauman
Leeds.
Institute at the
Y
University
fue
of
también
Leeds
profesor de Sciences
for
Po
several
en
years, and he
París,
was also
la
professor of
Universidad
Sciences Po in Paris,
Aarhus,
and the
perdón, y la UCLA.
Aarhus University and the UCLA
Adrián
as
es
well.
autor de múltiples
Adrian
obras
is the
sobre
author of
migración,
several
multiculturalismo,
works on
cosmopolitismo y
migration,
ciudades. Y
multiculturalism,
actualmente, que por eso
cosmopolitanism,
está en
and
Argentina,
cities. And
dirige
currently,
el
and this is why he is in
proyecto
Argentina, he is
Mi'kmaq,
directing the
Orden y Fronteras
Mi'kmaq
de la
Project,
Desigualdad
the
Global,
Orders
Migración y
and Borders
Movilidades en
of
el
Global
Capitalismo
Inequality,
Tardío,
Migration and
proyecto
Mobilities
de
in
5
Late
años que
Capitalism. This is
tiene
a 5-year
además
project
subproyectos
that
al interior,
also
es un proyecto estos
also has
Horizon,
his own
es
projects
un ERC que
inside.
entonces lo
This
ganó Adrián, pero el grupo es un
was
grupo que tiene
there's a
5 cabezas
project that was
en
won
donde
by Adrian,
estamos
but this is a
trabajando en
5-headed
subregiones.
project, and we are
En el
working
caso
in
de Latinoamérica tenemos
sub-regions.
un proyecto
In the case of Latin
chiquito
America,
que
we have a
básicamente lo
very
que
small
analizamos
project
es
where
migración
basically we
venezolana
analyze
y
Venezuelan
boliviana, es decir, una
migration
migración
and
reciente y una
Bolivian
migración
migration.
más
Is a very
tradicional
recent
en
one a recent
Santiago de
migration and
Chile
another one that is
y
more
en Ciudad
traditional
de Buenos
in
Aires.
Santiago de Chile and the city of Buenos
Estamos,
Aires.
el objetivo del proyecto tiene,
The
bueno, es un
objective
proyecto
of this
chiquito, insisto.
project,
Hoy Adrián
this
va a
is
contar
a
como
small
lo que sería la
project,
gran base
and
del
Adrian
proyecto, la base
is
teórica y
going to
también algunas
talk about
dinámicas que
the
estamos
theoretical
analizando.
foundations and some
Del
dynamics that
equipo
we are
de
analyzing
LATAM,
in
hasta ahora
the
tenemos
Latin
una
American
postdoc
team.
que acaba de ganar la beca, que es
Up to
Natalia
now, we
Bandi, que
have a
arrancó
postdoctoral fellow who is Natalia Bandi, who just
hoy,
started.
anteayer, hace
She
5
started,
días,
I think, the day
en
before yesterday
agosto
or
de este
5 days
año, va a
ago,
estar haciendo su postdoc
at the beginning of
en
August, and she's going to
sociales.
do her postdoctoral
Está Joana
research
Sander,
here
que
in the
está sosteniendo la
School of
cámara.
Social
No
Sciences. We
veo la
have Joana
necesidad,
Sander,
no hace
who is
falta que
holding
me
the
vean.
camera here.
Que es la asistente de investigación.
She
Y la
is
idea es
an
que el año
assistant
que viene se
researcher,
sume a nuestro
and
equipo
next year
un postdoctorando más.
another postdoctoral
El
fellow will be
primer
joining our
ejercicio
team.
que vamos a hacer con Natalia
The
de Bandi
first
es
exercise that we're going to do with
apoyar una
Natalia
parte
De
que va a
Bandi
explicar Adrián,
is to
así que no quiero
support a
spoilear
part
y
that Adrian
adelantarme
is going to speak
demasiado
about.
a
I
lo
don't
que
want
él
to
va a
spoil
decir,
it. I
pero
don't want to go
básicamente Natalia entra
ahead of myself
para
in relation to what he's going to talk about.
para fortalecer la pata
But basically, Natalia
cuantitativa
is
del
entering to
proyecto,
strengthen the quantitative
la
part of the
estadística
project.
que dialoga con el
Statistics
Instituto
that
Europeo.
dialogue with the European
Hay
Institute.
eco porque se abrió
I'm
un
sorry, there's an
teléfono.
echo.
No es tan fácil, parece todo fácil, pero es todo muy complicado.
Everything seems very easy, but it's not that
Igual ahora
easy.
estoy
It's quite
hablando en español,
complicated,
así que
actually.
tenemos un
Right now I'm
minuto antes
speaking
de
in
que
Spanish,
hable
so
Adrián.
just for 1 minute before Adrian
Pero bueno,
starts
la idea es que
speaking.
avanzamos con una pata más
But the idea is that
estadística y
we are going
cuantitativa,
to
por eso
develop a
elegimos un
more
perfil
quantitative
como
and
el de
statistic
Natalia de
part of our
Bandi, y
project,
la
and
idea
that's
es
why we chose
organizar la
Natalia's
producción de
profile.
datos
And the idea is
para
to organize production
contribuir
of
a
data
una
to
dimensión que es bien
contribute
importante en este proyecto,
to
que
a
es
very important
global,
dimension in this
que
project,
coordina en
which is
gran
global,
medida Ettore
and
Ricci, es decir, el
that is
Instituto
coordinated by
Europeo,
Ettore Ricci from
sobre
the European Institute
desigualdades y
about
migración y movilidades, ¿sí?
inequality and
Movilidades
migration and
entendiéndolas no
mobilities.
solo como la migración en
Understanding
sentido
mobilities
clásico,
not
sino
only
sobre
in the
todo
classic
mirando
sense,
patrones
but
de viajes y
also,
turismo, que esta es como la
mostly
gran
looking at patterns of
novedad, sobre todo
travel
para
and
nuestros
tourism,
estudios
which is the big
migratorios en nuestra región. En
new
general,
thing in our
son
migration
campos
studies in
de
our region.
observación muy
These are
diferenciados,
usually
con
very
especialistas que no
differentiated
mezclan y no
fields of
miran
observation with
estas dinámicas de
specialists who do
movilidad
not
en
mix
general,
or look
que
at these
tienen
different
mucho para
mobility
contarnos en sus
dynamics that
relaciones, ¿no?
have
Hay
a lot
hipótesis
to tell
bien
us about in
interesantes.
their
No voy a seguir
relations.
avanzando porque
This is
Adrián
very
va a
interesting. I'm not
contar un
going to
poco sobre
go
esta
deep into
dimensión
this
de las
because Adrian is going to
movilidades,
talk about this
pero
dimension
quiero
of
darle la
mobilities.
palabra
But
a Caro Mera,
I'd like
que
to
es
give the
la
floor to
anfitriona
Carolina
en el
Mera, who is our
Instituto Gino Germani.
host,
Yo
our
solía
hostess
ser
here at
investigadora del
the
instituto hasta no
Gino
hace
Germani
mucho
Institute.
y me
I
pasé
was
al núcleo de
up
estudios
to
migratorios de
recently
la
a
Universidad de San
researcher
Martín
at this
y
institute,
ahora
and now I
somos
work at the
instituciones
University of San
hermanas que
Martin.
trabajamos
Now we
en
are
agendas
sister
comunes.
institutions working together on common
Carolina Mera.
agendas.
Bueno,
Carolina
gracias
Mera.
Ana.
Thank you, Anna.
Bienvenido, Adrián.
Welcome. Welcome,
En
Adrian.
primer lugar, agradecer
First
efectivamente
of
a
all, I
Ana
would
la
like to
realización de este
thank
seminario
Anna
con el
for this
proyecto
seminar, the organization of this seminar with this project,
Eh,
MOGMED.
Es importante también para nosotros, para los colegas y las
Sorry,
colegas del
MIGMOBS. It's
instituto,
important for us, the colleagues at the
seguir
Institute,
dialogando en estos temas.
to
En ese
continue
sentido,
establishing
también
a dialogue in
agradecerle a
relation to these
Emilio,
topics.
que
I
es
would
a
also
partir
like
de
to
quien
thank Emilio,
ya recibimos
which is
alguna vez
through
a Adrián acá en el
which we have
instituto.
already
Y bueno, es
received
una alegría
Adriano,
tenerlo de nuevo y
Adrian
hoy
here at the
para
Institute.
discutir o
And
debatir, como
we are very
decía
pleased
Ana,
to have
algunos
him
conceptos y
again at the
perspectivas,
Institute and to share some
muchas de
concepts
las
and
cuales
perspectives,
trabajamos
many of
desde
which
acá, desde nuestras
we are working on
problemáticas y tal
from
vez
here in
podemos
relation to our
encontrar
particular
citas.
contextual problems, and
Así que
we
bueno,
will probably find
agradecerles
many
a todos y
lines
darles
in
la
common. So
bienvenida
I would like to thank you all
a
and also
todos,
welcome you.
Bueno,
todas.
sin
Welcome all
más
of you.
presentación y
Okay, without further
prolegómeno, le
ado,
doy la palabra
I
a
will give
Adrián
the floor
Fabel.
now to
Adrián
Adrian
Fabel
Fabel.
tiene
Adrian
libros,
Fabel
tiene artículos, digo, lo que va a
has
hacer es
many
como una
books
suerte de gran
published and
repaso,
articles. He's
aterrizándolo
going
al proyecto que
to
tenemos. Y resulta
review
realmente como
them in
muy
relation to the project that we
interesante.
have.
Tenés colegas
And
también como
it
Sandra
is,
Gil que han debatido
you also have
bastante
colleagues
la
like
cuestión de la
Sandra Hill
integración,
who
así
have
que creo que
debated the issue of
vamos a tener un
integration.
debate lindo
So
y
I think that we're going
productivo.
to have a
Bueno,
very
Adrián,
productive and
sin
interesting
más,
debate tonight.
bienvenido.
Adrian, without
Te
further
escuchamos
ado,
con mucha
welcome.
atención
We
e
will now be
interés.
listening to you with great attention and interest.
Pueden pasar al eso les íbamos a decir. Hay un canal
There
alternativo
is a
para
channel,
escuchar
an
el
alternative
audio
channel
que está saliendo de
to
esta sala,
listen
que
to
ahora
the
va a
audio.
pasar Adrián a hablar en inglés. Lo pueden escuchar, las personas que están virtualmente, lo pueden escuchar en otro
So those of
canal
you who are connected
para
virtually
escuchar la
can
traducción
listen
simultánea
to
en
Adrián
español, que tenemos una
in
colega
Spanish.
maravillosa online haciendo este trabajo.
¿Está bien? Ok. Gracias, Ana, Carolina, colegas, amigas, aquí at the Institute de Investigadores Ino-Germani. Thank you for this invitation. I'm very happy to return to Buenos Aires. I came in 2018 when I met some of you then, met Anna, and that was the beginning of our collaboration for this project, which you have heard a little introduction to. We have a small working group here, so my talk, which I have written as a text, I might, kind of jump through a little so we can get to discussion. And the text is available as well for anyone if you ask me or Anna afterwards. So I'm here to talk about my book, The Integration Nation, and this is the theoretical framework, as I see it, for the MIGMOBS project. MIGMOBS, the orders and borders of global inequality, migration and mobilities in late capitalism. You can find a website at the University College Cork, which is the organizing institution. MIGMOBS is a global scale project that seeks to establish a new paradigm for international migration research that will take us beyond the typical one-way linear way of thinking about immigration and the integration citizenship that follows, the paradigm that is patterned on major immigration receiving countries of what I call in the book the North Atlantic West, for good reasons. In this literature, the archetype of the USA, the United States of America, as well as its migration scholarship, often mixed with a certain image of Canada, I think, as a kind of ideal type, is always paramount. And of course, we hear a lot about West European cases. And our fundamental concern is with the stability of a global hierarchy of citizenship or nationalities. I see this paradigm, this way of thinking about population as sustaining. That is, there's an index of global inequality reflected in the notorious birthright lottery determining life chances internationally, with North America and West European countries always at the top. Countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia, at the bottom, and something like Latin America in the middle, more or less. But there's a league table of inequality that's familiar from global inequality research. That is, on the fact that on a global comparison of all individuals in the world, the nationality you were born with, which is an arbitrary fact about a person, is overwhelmingly determinant of your life chances. This is Milanovic's argument. And those holding particularly North American, West European, and passports from a handful of other countries are massively advantaged in relation to those unlucky to be born in other countries, particularly at the bottom of the scale, in terms of their now, of course, you can measure this with income or GDP per capita, quality of life, mortality, or other statistics that measure inequality. But here is one way of measuring it that speaks to migration and mobilities particularly. Now, this is data from our partner project, the Global Mobilities Project, directed by Ettore Recchi, who some of you may have met earlier this year, presented here. And the map differentiates different nationalities according to how easy it is to financially access freedom of movement as a tourist. So very simply, if you're from one of the yellow countries, you can move around the world very cheaply as a tourist with access. If you're from one of the dark blue countries, it's very expensive, 80 times more expensive in some cases. Plus there will be very limited access, and you get an idea of a scale from this. Argentina, as you may guess, is somewhere in the middle, higher in status than some of its Latin American neighbors. Historically, this world system is in effect a world order of racial capitalism centered in the North Atlantic West, where these imperial colonial powers, we argue, have remained dominant through the last 2 centuries via an exploitative, extractive, yet highly selective and sometimes murderously exclusive mode of governing national, regional, and world populations, to put it dramatically. Now, you'll detect that there's a Marxist element to this, and also, as you'll explain, a kind of Foucauldian way of thinking. My goal is critical, it's not prescriptive, but I do note in passing that we are, as migration scholars, we are generally normatively committed to, in an optimistic way, to the progressive potential of migration and mobility as border crossings in changing this world for the better. So, and we are in this project obviously interested in how does migration and mobility potentially change this terrible order that seems to be there, this inequality that is, as I say, is rather stable historically. And the problem is, and this is maybe something for discussion, is that the migration and mobilities that we often celebrate in recent decades are also inherently a part of the neoliberalism that we condemn. There is a kind of relationship between the two things. This is difficult. Now, I'm essentially a student of the transnationalism and post-nationalism of the 1990s. Some examples on the left: Nina Glick-Schiller, Yasmin Soysal, very well known in the Western literature. And our current project tries to update this commitment to the present-day language of decolonization and open borders, with references to work particularly such as Itendai Achume's recent work on migration as decolonization. She's a African scholar based at UCLA, a legal scholar. In theory, open borders and mass migration and mobility from the global south to the global north would be the most dramatic way in which the order of global inequality might change. And this also follows from Branko Milanovic's analysis of the birthright lottery. As Achume argues, this would be a decolonial and reparative change. Some see it happening already in the post-colonial politics and increasing diversity of many receiving countries. And this is the driving interest for many people in migration and mobilities. Yet, in 50 years, the era of neoliberalism, the global hierarchies of citizenship, the passport power that we identified before has not changed, or is not changing much. Global inequality measured this way, in fact, has got worse, even as migration and especially mobilities have grown exponentially. So you might say, and this is to put it in a provocative way, it is better than ever to have been born with a passport in Britain rather than Argentina, and emphatically much better than being born in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Somalia, or the Congo. Now this talk could sound a bit Eurocentric, and is one centered in the North Atlantic West. But in these recent works that I've published, I'm trying to ask a question that is still needed if the decolonization that we might aim for or what wish to see is to have any effect. That is, how and why do these countries in the North Atlantic West continue to hold this sovereign national power in the world, which is a kind of neo-colonial power that has something to do with their control over world population movements? What are, in other words, the sources of power in the ordered neoliberal world we live in? And my answer obviously is that it is something to do with the governance of international migration and mobilities. How this is governed. Now, many critical migration scholars would locate this power of governance at the border, typically, at the sovereign power of closing and controlling borders. The symbol of this border is often the wall being built across the most dramatic border between the global north and the global south in the world, the US-Mexico border. And while this is, of course, significant, in my work, I argue there's something more fundamental to population governance than the building of borders and exclusion, which even in the US-Mexico case is highly porous. Even that border is extremely porous. The powers of the sovereign nation state, in fact, lie ultimately and perhaps increasingly in their powers of integration, rather. This is what I argue. And this will be what I see as the integration nation. The power of the North Atlantic West, centered in the USA, with Western Europe and other settler colonies in its shadow, is not fundamentally a negative power of exclusion and violence at the border. It is a positive biopolitical power of extracting, the ability to extract, select, include, and integrate new citizens in a politics of citizenship that continues centuries of nation building of populations and territories, as well as the colonial logic that underpinned all of this. The highly dramatic necropolitics of the border are the essential flip side of this, the other side of it, but there would be no power if the power of liberal democracies was only state violence. Now, what do I mean by this? And here I go straight into what we might think of as mainstream empirical migration studies in the mainstream North Atlantic West. Immigrant integration, the idea of immigrant integration in recent years in Europe and increasingly in the US has remained the central focus of mainstream migration research and policy internationally, thinking about the processes of settlement and inclusion of migrants in new societies of residence. It is the positive side of migration policies that are otherwise focused on control, exclusion, and selective entry at the border. And it's reflected in this kind of work, particularly on the left, this is Richard Alber and Nancy Foner's Strangers No More, a study of 4 European countries along with the USA and Canada, published in 2015. This is a synthesis of the mainstream quantitative literature that measures the success and failure of immigrant integration policies across the North Atlantic West and draws best practice conclusions from a vision of these countries changing slowly for the better. And here I just mention in passing other very well-known international research indexes, such as the MIPEX index produced by the Migration Policy Group in Brussels, that is an index of international integration policies across 56 countries in 6 continents. This is being rolled out internationally. Argentina, of course, is included. So you can go look at where Argentina is rated in an integration scale. Refugee scholars have also been talking about integration with their own references and literature. And here on the right is an example of a journalistic work called The Integration Nation. It's a coincidence, celebrating America at its best. That is, America and its abilities to integrate refugees and benefit from the global diversity it heralds. And I just note in passing that this kind of image of the USA, of course, exists at the same time as our image of the USA, with everybody shooting each other with guns, massive racial tensions, Black Lives Matters and everything else. But the positive image of America as a nation of immigration and of diversity and of a Black president in past years is also there. I mean, that's also a source of why we all look to America. And the US literature, which is the biggest literature on migration in the world, remains central in the field internationally. You can tell me whether or not it's central in Latin America. I don't know in a way, but it is interesting to note that there's been a significant shift in the debates in the US in the last 20 years, which is also seen in Alba and Fona's book. And Alba and Fona are the direct heirs of the Chicago School of Ethnicity in sociology. It's absolutely mainstream sociology and hugely influential. And they've shifted from talking about integration instead of assimilation, because presumably integration is seen as more progressive, politically correct, and has two-way properties of social change. That's the idea. So integration is the key word that implies managed immigration leading to progressive outcomes and the evolving ability of advanced liberal North Atlantic Western nations to come to terms with immigration and diversity in a beneficial and positive way and transform themselves in the meantime, perhaps in a mutual direction with the global multicultural, multiracial diversity that immigration brings. This is the positive picture of immigrant integration as the future for North America, for Europe, and maybe the rest of the world. Now, the key point about the integration nation, as I see it, is the triumph and ubiquity of the North American linear model of the immigrant nation that this implies. The model settler nation built on immigration from around the world and increasing self-assimilation of particularly West European nations to the North American model in progressive parts of the immigration debate, even if it's an awkward match. The North American paradigm has increasingly become powerful as West European countries have also tried to narrate their histories of immigration away from older ethno-cultural myths of nationhood into forward-looking transformative trajectories of immigration and integration, particularly with the threat of anti-immigration politics on the right. In these, historical progress is reframed as a historical ability to respond to diversity, in which debates on multiculturalism, inclusion, or equality in terms of integration, as the encompassing way of talking about it, about how the nation is going to transform itself, absorb the diversity in order to emerge as a stronger nation. The point is that this is always a linear conception. It is seen and evaluated from the receiving country's perspective. You are a migrant who crosses a border. You are seen as an immigrant. You settle. You are subject to integration policies and integration pressures, to forces and opportunities. And if things work out positively, you will move towards citizenship and full participation in the nation. And somewhere down the road, you perhaps disappear into the natives of the country. This is called mainstreaming in Alba's work. That is, the majority who are always the reference population, you as a newcomer are measured against. And integration research is always about the difference between, it's the disappearance versus the visibility or racialization of minorities that are less successful versus those that are more successful at integrating. Integration research is generated from this problematic. The integrating immigrant who visibly and audibly carries their foreignness in terms of language, culture, religion, or race is measured against a putatively or assumed homogeneous majority population, which not coincidentally is usually a white majority population, into which some immigrants, because of their characteristics, will find it more or less difficult to disappear. So again, this is the immigrant integration paradigm. In the North American model, of course, the natives, peculiarly in classic assimilation models, are actually white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the role of the majority, who somehow historically become the reference group of natives in the models, even if they were, of course, not natives at all. They were settler colonials who moved to form the nation over the bodies of those who were already there and those brought violently through slavery, which is one of the one of the peculiar missing elements of the assimilation debates. This, of course, is a huge story elided by the settler colonial myth, repeated in the idealization of immigrant integration into the mainstream. It's actually the Chicago School model, and it's the racial system of modernity, in other words. I'm being very crude and blunt about what I'm saying, but that's the American literature, if you summed up. Now, just to give you an idea of what I mean, now this positive progressive image is the image perhaps of a Syrian family in Britain getting their citizenship, being received in a convivial, multiracial context in London with the mayor of a local borough. There's urban integration going on, participation, a successful outcome, and to top it all, we have the Queen in the background. Now, that image of the sovereign, of course, with the flag is a signal. It tells you that this is a story about the integration nation generating sovereignty through welcoming a disadvantaged population who become part of it when they receive their citizenship. On one level, of course, there's nothing wrong with this happy image that celebrates one family crossing the line from the global south to the global north. But there is a tension here, which is, of course, all the people and violence you don't see in the image. This image also presupposes a lot of people left behind in the sending countries, those populations that cannot move. Just as there are populations that cannot speak, subaltern populations, also there are those that cannot move because they're too old, because they cannot get refugee status, because they don't have the resources to cross borders. I'm saying that there's always some sort of selection always going on with the population movements, and this is a damaging and difficult point from the point of view of refugee studies. This is often elided in the celebrating narrative of refugee integration, the left behind people who came from the wrong war, the wrong religion, the wrong race, or whatever it was that stopped them from getting where they wanted to go, or indeed the new life in the interim places where they ended up staying in displaced conditions. So we have to be very cautious with these celebratory images, which are very typical in migration research. The other thing is that it's putting value on something. It's putting value on something that I didn't bring today, because I'm advised not to carry it around, but which I ought to be brandishing about. That is my British passport. It's an image of national branding. These people are getting a British passport, and by getting a British passport, you become someone who maybe has not wiped out the lottery of life by becoming someone like me who got it arbitrarily through being born in the country, but who nevertheless has taken a first step towards an equality, overcoming global inequality. Now, it's actually not clear, however, despite all the immigration and asylum granted, that globalization has widened access to winners around the world, even with the proliferation of double passports and citizenship for sale. But this is something we need to investigate. Having certain passports in this world of selective mobility is something of huge value and remains so symbolically and materially at borders. And we know from economists such as Milanovic, you can put a measure on the value as a determining factor in global inequality, as I said. So in this photo, we're, in other words, looking at an image of global inequality, the fact of the inequality being erased for some, which is a triumph for citizenship or human rights, perhaps, but it's only for a very select few, and I'm arguing for an increasingly selective few. I hope we're doing okay. Yes. I'll go faster at some point.
No.
Yeah. The power to choose who gets in and who doesn't is all about how states generate power through bordering. Now, this is where the story gets a little more complex, perhaps, because a lot of what I've been saying is very familiar from critical migration studies. If you look at, particularly in the context I work in, Nicholas de Geneva's work on the US and Europe, Bridget Anderson's brilliant work on Britain, Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen's Borderers Method, which is from the Italian autonomist school. Now, where I take a different line has been to not focus, as they typically do, on the marginalized and most abject subjects of migration. That is not on the most disadvantaged or the precariously mobile, those that we know extensively through ethnographic migration and border studies, and those who obviously suffer the fact of global inequality, the borders, the militarized control, the racial differentiation, the exclusions. And these are all necessary parts of our migration studies. But rather, I have taken the analytical strategy of looking at those less visible, but in fact much more numerous in the migration mobility systems that we have in the world, such as free-moving, middling or middle-class migration, mobile people such as students and professionals, moving across borders precisely because it is assumed they are free of the constraints and discriminations that other quote-unquote migrants face. Now, I wrote a book about Eurostars called Eurostars and Cities, about EU citizens, and there may be interesting parallels between the European Union and Mercosur agreements worth thinking about. And the point about the work is to point out that just as we can see how the state asserts obvious power through the control of unwanted migration and selective welcome of wanted immigrants by letting some people across as good immigrants while excluding the bad and unwanted migrants of the world, we often forget that states are also generating huge amounts of power and income, in fact, through the way that they let, at the same time, vast numbers of people come and grow across borders at the same time. That is, those who move apparently without any problem at all as effectively unmarked and invisible movers. Exactly how that happens should also be a key part of our problematic as migration scholars. Migration, and a quote-unquote migration, classified as such, is in fact only a tiny part of what we call mobilities, the multiple transactions of persons across borders taking place in the global neoliberal capitalist economy. And it gets even bigger, in a sense, as a question when you think about non-physical mobilities as well as part of this problematic, as we do in the Global Mobilities Project. The migration and mobilities literatures have to be brought together to understand how and why migrants get included or excluded. In other words, we have to talk about tourists as well as refugees in order to understand anything, I think, about migration and inequality, because the categorization of these things is vital to global neoliberalism and its evolution over the last 50 years. It is literally all about these people moving around while others remain immobile or restricted. And I just note as a passing thing that COVID, of course, is also interesting because it for a brief period puts in place a new order of mobilities globally, which changes state power in some ways. The migration mobilities continuum is all about how a very national portion of people moving across borders are selected to become immigrants that can be integrated, a tiny proportion, whose symbolic over-importance at the border politically in sustaining nationhood and the multicultural transformations of the nation actually relate as well to the banality and neutrality of so many other cross-border movements. I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about UK and Britain, which may seem a bit exotic, and then France, to give you a sense of how these dynamics work in the European context. Now, British politics since the 2000s, since 2000 and onwards, have been dominated by obsessive and very heated debates about the numbers of immigrants entering the country, like in lots of countries. And it actually happened in Britain before the Conservatives came to power in 2010. So it's not an argument only about right-wing Conservative Party rule, and we will see it continuing in the new Labour Party government. Now, this is what we call the hostile environment in British politics, and it's symbolised by this van, which was a van that was driving around London, offering in a very neoliberal way the opportunity for migrants to give themselves up and go home, and they get you actually get entered into a prize or something if you do this. You know, there was a material incentive for this, and this is the image of the hostile environment that everybody I mean, it's very familiar in Britain. And the way in which Britain during this decade focused all of the governmental power and all of the issues of legitimacy about population management on the management of immigrants, you know, what we're calling immigrants in the country. So we have to do, when this is the case, the government saying we have to do citizenship and sovereignty and control and identifying these populations on this population, the good immigrants and the bad immigrants, if you like. There were about 300,000 migrants coming to the country annually. That was the typical number that was given, 300,000. And David Cameron, the Prime Minister before Brexit, had set himself a target of 100,000. And because he gave himself a target, it created a very poisonous and negative politics. You know, he couldn't achieve this politics. And so it created lots of negative anti-immigration politics. So you can see the political generation of issues around immigration here. And these 300,000 migrants are the typical migrants that would be counted in OECD or UN statistics. So the conventional migrants, we have numbers for every country. And yet they hide all kinds of other movements that are going on. So at one end of these figures, there are tens or dozens, you know, small numbers in the UK case of illegal or irregular migrants who managed to cross to the UK in boats or containers. And these small numbers of people have been the subject of mass hysteria politically. You know, people are going down to the beach, and "Stop the boats" was the motto of our previous Prime Minister, a British Asian Prime Minister, using this motto that is now being used by the far right. Absolute hysteria about relatively small numbers of boats. Irregular migration is much more likely to take place, in fact, via overstaying, work visas, student migration, or tourism, that we know. And that's obviously another part of the story. Official refugees during the same period, and we're talking about 2015 or 16, so just before Brexit, they were not dramatically more numerous. There was the Mediterranean migration crisis going on. The UK was going crazy about 35,000 refugees coming to the country at the same time that Germany was accepting 1 million. So they're only 10% of official migrants anyway, 300,000, despite the massive symbolic politics. So again, you get this idea of symbolic politics generating. And the amazing thing is that these numbers that were generating the negative politics of anti-immigration that eventually leads to Brexit, it's the major cause of Brexit, were being recorded at the same time, the very same time that in tourist statistics, we're recording 35 million people pouring across the border annually as tourists or visitors to the country. And this figure has gone even higher since COVID. So there's something funny going on here. That's what I'm saying. In Britain, 1 in 100 persons crossing the border is an immigrant. Only 1 in 10 of those immigrants are refugees. And of the 100 that cross the border, the other 99 are people that we're just not interested in as migration scholars because they're tourists and business visitors. The line between nationals and foreigners at the heart of all citizenship and nationality law is not what we think it is, however. Look a bit closer, and this number starts to be composed, the 99 starts to be composed of many more ambiguous populations, some of whom can become visible or legible in migration terms, although they may have maybe nothing to do with the politics of integration. That is, they're not integratable migrants. They're not migrants who are going to become immigrants anytime soon. But they are present in the nation. And some may be business people and tourists. There's lots of people coming and going. But what about students? What about nurses? What about domestic care and agricultural workers on short-time deployment, temporary workers on long-term visas involving GATS statuses and others? And the picture is of workers at a coffee shop and London's newspapers. And the point is that there are political economies around these very fluid and mobile populations, many of whom are not ever really seen as visible or legible migrants in the way that the statistics suggest. but they're part of a functioning system. There's also a migration of undocumented as well in Britain, which maybe is about 1 million people. But now the point is, there's something going on in the state power being generated by the official differentiated bordering going on, the 300,000, versus the 99% who are being classified or being made invisible at the border in some sense, while the politics is obsessively focusing on the 1% of supposedly visible, legible immigrants who are marked as foreigners and racialized as such. And how this differentiation has evolved and become ever more fine-grained in the 5 decades of global neoliberalism is the key question of Mi'kmob's project. And this is where I use a bit of data from Etere, our colleague, Etere Reki. Etere and the Mi'kmob's project ultimately will hopefully have lots of detailed information, not only about the macro data, but also bilateral relations between countries that enable us to look at exactly how this is evolving. But what Etere's global data suggests is that from 1960 to 2019, while migrants in the world, as officially counted, are rising significantly, and it is the dramatic rise in migration that migration scholars focus on.
Yes.
Mobilities have gone like this. And we need to know how this works. We think this is the key feature of global neoliberalism, i.e. the US-led globalization of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. It's better known and better measured in political economy terms by financialization across borders, foreign direct investment, container ship trade patterns, digital and cultural communication flows, or even conventional international migration, or better kind of map this kind of change than data on mobilities does. But the rise of mobilities as an exponential growth in relation to official migration is, we argue, the big story here. And the historical evolution since the onset of neoliberalism in the 1970s is astonishing. And this is basically what we're trying to do with the Global Mobilities Project. So part of our answer in studying this is to explain the more obsessive focus of national politics on ever smaller numbers of people who count as international migrants amongst the flows. And I am very interested in the negative politics of anti-immigration in a lot of work that I do. We know a lot about this, and it is the focus of a lot of study of migration politics. But we also have to think about this positive focus, the positive politics as well as the negative that focus on the bordering and keeping certain categories of migrant out of the country at the same time as others are let in, and a certain sort of positive integration is generated. And the politics in the country can swing one way or the other. And with the establishment of the hostile environment in the 2010s, the dynamics of restricting asylum and family migration took a particularly sinister turn. And this particular case, the case of West Indian British residents, usually children of the first generation that came in the 1950s, gives us a clue to how the line can move across different populations to categorize people as immigrants sometime in a negative politics, at a time where at other times they're seen as a positive politics of a multiracial nation. And what happened around the time of the Mediterranean crisis in 2015 is that the hostile environment started to check people's documentation when they went to collect medical benefits or social benefits. Black West Indians, British West Indians, elderly mostly in many cases, were going to check for medical care, and suddenly were being held by the police as illegal immigrants because they didn't have documentation proving that they were British. They were long-term citizens, they'd been residents for life, they were totally integrated, but they did not have official papers to prove this. And they suddenly fell foul of the sovereign power that classifies them all of a sudden. It moves across them at the different side of a line, which now says, oh, now you're immigrants, and you're in an immigrant category that is deportable because you're not, you're like the unwanted immigrants that the van is looking for, the immigration van is looking for. Forgetting, of course, I mean, it's not only the fact that they're being treated as immigrants when they're not immigrants, they're British citizens and have been for their entire life, but they even forgets the fact that their parents weren't really immigrants in the classic sense of the word, in the classic American sense of the word. They were in fact British subjects. There was no immigration in the first place. They came to the UK during a time of empire. They moved within an empire. And this again messes up, this begins to raise really important issues about, you know, what we're talking about with the nation and the territory and the borders. And I make a big deal of this issue because how states generate power through bordering, making legible and rendering visible or invisible different populations on the move, this shifting of the line across populations, is what I call political demography, the study of political demography, because it lies at the heart not only of the Windrush scandal, which was a terrible scandal, but which finally was revealed, but also explaining Brexit and Britain's exit from the European Union. Can you bear? Is this still doing okay for time? Yeah.
We are.
Yeah, we're fine.
Wonderful.
I've still got. I'm getting page 9.
I think the translation is working well.
Yeah, because there's an argument building here, obviously. So, you may have seen this man. You may have seen this man in images in the news from the UK this weekend. Some terrible images that have come through of riots, far-right anti-immigration riots that have been taking place all across towns and cities in the north of England, particularly where I live. And the man most responsible for the shifting politics of anti-immigration in the UK is this politician, Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the far right. He doesn't see himself as leading the rioters, but he's basically saying the same things as that. And he was recently elected for the first time as a member of parliament in July, leading the Reform Party, which basically destroyed the election for the Conservatives because he got 20% of the vote. That's why Labour got elected on a very small vote as well. Now, this poster was probably the low point of British politics, well, this century and last century, I would say. I mean, this particular poster that was put up in London a week before the Brexit vote in 2016. Has anyone seen this before? No, it's a very interesting poster. It actually is an explicit reference to Nazi propaganda of the 1930s or 40s, and it's a poster of, well, he put it up the same day, the very same day that a young female member of parliament, Jo Cox, who was known for her progressive views on refugee accommodation, was assassinated in the streets of northern England. So there was a political assassination, same day. As Farage was putting up his poster, a week before the British election, in order to generate support for people against the European Union, which is said to be to blame for this mass of people moving across a border, which is in Central Eastern Europe. It's a border, I think, with Slovenia and Slovakia. Now, these are obviously, well, possibly, we don't know, these are single men being racialized as Muslims, probably, Syrians, perhaps on the move, we're not told. It's seen as the fault of the EU, and Farage is using this image as a way of shifting the line of the debate about all of these different populations in Britain, this very varied population of minority British, Black Asian British, lots of foreign European populations, lots of new migrants and global diversity, shifting the line so that those populations are associated with the European Union, and particularly with the problem that the European Union was causing for Britain, the real problem, which was freedom of movement of EU citizens in the country. Farage used this image as a way of shifting the line of the debate about all of these different populations in Britain to call all kinds of populations who were in fact not immigrants in the country. So it's about identifying groups of people who we can call immigrants to fuel anti-immigration politics, but who, if we were analytical and legal about the categories, would not be seen as immigrants. And the first I would say is actually, it's quite important if you're studying refugees and asylum population, that they shouldn't be classified as immigrants in a conventional sense until they become settled immigrants. And that's a process that happens later. They are populations who can claim protection as a certain kind of status. It's human rights and refugee law internationally. And this is always a typical move in anti-immigration debates, of course. We think of refugees as immigrants, and that's a problem already. They're also, I mean, they're being associated also with a very ambiguous mobile population in Europe, which is a Roma population, which, again, it's not a problem for Britain, but it is a problem for the nation state in Europe because Roma population are inherently nomadic and not immigrants again. But that he goes well beyond this. At the same time as he's doing this, he's of course shifting the line across British Muslims, British citizens who, like the British West Indians, mostly have been British for generations, British all their lives, can even be thought of as British forever in a sense because they were part of an empire that made them British subjects to begin with before they ever moved to the UK. And they are also being associated with this image. And there's a hugely Islamophobic politics that we're now seeing exploding in the anti-immigration politics linked with this kind of shifting of the line. We saw it happen, of course, with the Black British, the shifting of the line. They're not being associated with this image necessarily. But most amazingly, even if only for a week, with his rhetoric, Farage was even able to shift the line enough that all of these people pouring across a very distant border, European border, far from the UK, they will never get to the UK because British membership of the EU takes care of that problem. Well, before they ever get close to the UK, they're not immigrants at all. They're being associated with, the image here is being associated with actually 3.5 million EU nationals living in the country, who also were not immigrants at all in the UK. This is where the Mercosur question maybe gets interesting. If you're an EU national living in the UK before Brexit, you're a European living in another part of Europe. You're not an immigrant living in Britain. That's by definition or not. You're a free mover. But for 1 week only, on the back of this recategorization that Farage had been building for years through media attention, through obsessive focus on East European migrants and racialization of migrants. But even the respectable scholarship, what was really a sort of central problem in my work is all of the respectable scholarship on analyzing British politics accepts the rhetoric that Farage is using, calls them EU immigrants. He'd been building this for years. Nobody was thinking critically about the popular categories it was adopting. And for a week only, and it really was only a week only, he was able to get enough people to see it that way so that they would vote for Brexit, take them over the line. I call this crossing the race line for obvious reasons. 52% for a day in order to get Brexit voted. And that was a day, the one day particularly, it was peaking, in which Black and Asian citizens, British citizens, could be attacked with hate crime and told to go home. And asylum seekers, as we're seeing, would be threatened with their house being burnt down. But at the same time, even rich, white EU citizens, professionals living their lives in the UK would now basically have to integrate and become immigrants in order to stay in Britain. That's the issue with Brexit, basically what Brexit was all about. For the end of free movement. It's not the only determining factor of Brexit, but I would argue overwhelmingly Brexit was about the end of free movement in Britain. Dealing with anomalous populations, in other words. So Brexit was more about classifying people who were not immigrants as immigrants than a kind of anti-immigration vote. It, of course, used race and racism to achieve this. And the irony was, as soon as Brexit was done, once sovereignty was reasserted, the immigration problem melted away, initially at least, as this politician, Boris Johnson, benefited from the political events and came in. This is our Donald Trump, maybe not, I don't know, Millet-style politician, Boris Johnson. Still the most popular politician in the UK by a long way. I mean, people absolutely love Boris, and he'll be back, I'm sure. the image of the impact of Farage's success, Farage was the winner, of course, in Brexit, was to generate political legitimacy, a new sense of sovereignty, the island nation separating itself from Europe and taking back sovereignty, particularly over migration, because there would be no more free movement. All free movement would, in this vision, become immigration, and immigration could be selective, and we can do positive things with immigration at that point. And I would say that anti-immigration, I mean, the Farageist view remains a minority view. It's nothing like 52% of the British population. I wouldn't even, it's probably not 30%. It's probably quite a lot less who really support anti-immigration, and particularly with EU immigrants taken out of the equation. And this is where, I mean, this is where it kind of gets paradoxical, but really important to kind of think about the other side of all of this, is that the other side of this anti-immigration thing in Britain is this. It's images of multiracial Britain winning gold medals in the Olympics. And this was 2012 was a celebration of multicultural, multiracial Britain. This is from 2012. And this is also, I mean, this is, you know, rioting in the streets may be part of our image in the future, if Farage gets his way. But the self-image in popular culture, sports teams, and in fact in the post-colonial literature is this: Britain as a convivial, multiracial society. And what the mainstream politicians know, Johnson, I think Keir Starmer as well, is that the phony problem of immigration can be solved once you put a flag on it. That is, the outcome of mixing of populations isn't to question the border of the British population, rather to reaffirm its remarkable power of integration once we've solved the free movement problem. The point is about how Brexit dealt with the sovereign problem of all those other anomalous populations who were going to never become citizens in the linear way, but fell instead in categories of movers of temporary residents, post-national members, tourists, EU citizens, temporary migrants, and so forth. All these other people who are moving back and forth across the border, who's still there in some ways, but who on any given day can make up hundreds and thousands of additional population who are not part of the immigrant integration question. But we focus on immigration. We either focus on anti-immigration border control, or we focus on integration as the negative and the positive politics of immigration. And this is the great British story. And this is what Boris Johnson also endorses for other reasons. For political economic reasons, he's very pro-immigration because he likes unrestricted global immigration, in fact. As a positive progressive story of the great nation coming to terms with immigration that leaves all of this out. And one of the weird things, as I've also pointed out, in the post-war era is where politics and policy come together. This production of the nation as a bordered territory is a long story about how British subjects and the empire were turned into immigrants that then could be integrated into a multiracial, multicultural nation. This is the standard narrative of British post-war immigration. As long as they can be British, you put a flag on them, you have sovereign power. The sovereign power is very clear in this picture. It's the London Olympics. And I would say that this is the image of the British dream as the American dream. What's the American dream as the British dream? And it's something that a positive politics has been generated around, and which I think will continue to assert itself even with the anti-immigration dynamics. Now, this is integration as governmentality, which is a biopolitical view of the nation state. Immigrant integration is a biopolitical device. It's a device about producing good citizens, ideal citizens, world-class athletes, world-class academics, world-class outstanding individuals, you know, the stuff that we do under the banner of neoliberalism in these advanced liberal West Atlantic nation states who see themselves still as the progressive leadership of the world. Societies who are at the top of the World Inequalities Index, or indeed any index you can care to take, from quality of life to liberty, who produce who are going to produce these particular sorts of individuals. And the idealized individual, of course, in this model actually then becomes one who's then free to move internationally. So the global elites are the production of this biopolitics, which is the other side of the story. The one population that's never subject to integration is, of course, a global elite population who can move wherever they want and be wherever they want, whereas immigrants are always subject to integration of the nation state in order to reaffirm its nationhood in a world in which everything else is moving. These are the transformative powers of the integration nation, and of course, inviting you to think about who's left out of this picture. You know, the good citizens are only one side of the question. So this brings us back then to the question of global inequality, the birthright lottery, and ultimately, what I'm arguing that this is the sort of system of racial capitalism that we have under global neoliberalism, the ability to produce global individuals, the global elites, at the same time as producing nations that nationalized subjects who are the subject of integration, an increasingly symbolic population of immigrants in these countries. And it's what's commonly talked about in the literature. And of course, the global inequality literature raises the issue of how these things might change through decolonization and shifting our vision in a decentered ways to other parts of the globe. But now I'm going to give you a bit of an overkill. More images. The French football teams is the same image, the integration nation. This is also present in the French Olympics ceremony just recently. This is the World Cup winners in 1998 and 2018. And again, the problem with this image is, of course, we're talking about highly selective world-class athlete stars who've been selected by the nation to represent France or Britain at high levels, but are clearly not the world population of migrants or minorities as a whole, because it's a human capital-driven system. It's a human capital-driven system of outstanding individuals representing the nation and reaffirming national sovereignty. And I'm sort of doing this in a backwards way because the beginning of my book begins with the most, I think, terrible image of all. After these positive images, you're seeing the worst, the bad image to start off with, which is a classic still from the start of the film La Bataille d'Alger by Guido Pontecorvo, which you probably do all know or are familiar with. Classic of decolonial struggle, which when you go look at it again, the very first scene in this film is an image that I think we can associate with the images I've been showing you. That is, in the first scene of this film, the French soldiers have an Algerian man that they've tortured in order to tell them where the location is of the leaders of the Algerian Liberation Front. And to do this, they've dressed him up as a French soldier. The colonel comes in and says, "We are now ready, let's take him." And one of the soldiers shoves a hat on the Algerian man and says, "Intégration." And everyone laughs, the soldiers laugh. The man runs to the window crying, wailing, and they tell him, "Get on with this, otherwise we'll start anew again." And what I'm saying, this is integration, in other words, as integration visualized as torture, bullying, compliance, and conformity. You give the guy a cap and he's part of the nation, the righteous nation that is crushing the terrorist revolution. The decolonial is crushing the decolonial struggle that takes place in Algeria at the same time. And the question is, of course, is it the same one as the ones I've been showing, the French football team and so on? And here I'm skipping quite quickly. And of course, the book eventually comes to the real difficult meat of the question, which is, so, okay, you know, once you've gone through the critique of integration and this order of racial capitalism that seems to be with us and being reproduced in immigration politics, what's the transformative vision? There's obviously a necessity in migration studies field to open it up, to reassess attempts at formulating certain notions of open borders, post-national and transnational thinking, arguments from the 1990s onwards, arguments, I think, from other continents, about other dynamics of politics, perhaps. I think there's a lot of potential in thinking about Latin America and East Asia in a different way to this very standard European Euro-North American kind of mode that I'm describing. Reassessing the problems that the arguments get into on post-national, transnational, and decolonial thinking in terms of the limitations of human rights, the problems of the migration development dynamics. You know, 1990s, it was a win-win-win because it was all about remittances, but that has fallen away. The perpetuation of the very problematic link between post-nationalism, transnationalism, cosmopolitanism, and even human rights with neoliberalism, which is a point being emphasized in lots and lots of the critical literature, you know, the Duke University Press anthropology type literature, very critical of these things. The need to continually ask what is there that we can identify in subaltern decolonial movements that goes beyond the problematic of all these other things that are associated with the discredited 1990s and the triumph of neoliberalism. And the difficult part of this is that so much of what we want to see as progressive, that is about people moving around the world, messing things up, making claims, changing the world, bottom-up movements, is also dependent on its relation to neoliberalism in many ways. But I don't think it's fully determinate, and you know, we want to be looking for the decolonial thought that's not hooked at source to the neoliberal global economy. That's the alternate politics. And there is an alternative politics here, and it's about, I think, putting the older literature with the newer literature and seeing what kind of criteria can be derived from this. And I think, you know, it's a normative kind of work. I just offer some suggestions here, but these may not be familiar. But Eilert Shakar's work on the birthright lottery has moved on to talk about the shifting border. Nina Glick-Schiller, who I showed earlier, her work on transnationalism, and a really great work with Ayşe Çalar, Turkish scholar, about transnational movements in urban politics, rejecting integration, but instead proposing different kinds of solidarity, counter politics, that arise in local places where you get a new sort of political movement that links together migrants, minorities, marginal populations, indigenous populations as well in some cases, with working class solidarities. Anne McNevin, who's an Australian scholar, has also done really interesting work in this line, linking migrant, refugee, and indigenous movements with the Black Lives Matters and environment movements. I mean, these movements have to be, I would argue, because of what I'm saying, fundamentally anti-national. That's the point here. The nation state, the integration nation, is the thing that sustains a particular sort of neocolonial racial capitalism, as I've suggested, with the global hierarchies and the reproduction of the power of the North Atlantic West in its own self-image. That's where the book goes. Migration is decolonization, but it's tentative, and our project is also set up to try and explore this. We can talk about that. And I just note in passing that there is also a postscript in the book about COVID-19, which is about what the effects on state power and sovereignty and the control of populations have how they changed for a while because of COVID-19, because of the abilities that were shown by states during that period to control mobilities, not only migration, but mobilities, govern them successfully without the neoliberal economy collapsing. We know some of the dynamics about who gets to be mobile and immobile in the world of COVID. Controlling movement across borders and controlling internal movements, which again could be ever more selective, not only on crude nationality grounds, crude racial grounds, and crude human capital grounds, but also on health grounds, on various sorts of biometric measures to do with the health of the nation versus the need for transactions and flows across borders, which of course affect tourists and other categories of mobility, but also create new sorts of precarious forms of mobile work at the fringes of the less mobile core economy. So I speculate a little bit about a movement here towards a new kind of liberalism that might be called a viral or perhaps epidemiological liberalism that's learned how to incorporate new forms of governance of mobilities along with this kind of particular governance of migration that has emerged. And and I asked the question: is there a fundamental shift in terms of state power and the management of populations? And our MIG-MOBS project and the Global Mobilities Project will be able to kind of show what happened during COVID and what happens after COVID, where apparently, if you go to Britain, there's more immigration than ever after Brexit, as well as more mobilities than ever, and an ever more poisonous kind of anti-immigration politics. So that's it.
Adrian, maybe I know that the translators, maybe they can translate you. So
Yeah.
Because I think that
I can try.
yes.
Nice to think. Yeah, here's some comments and thoughts. I mean, I've talked a lot. I'm sorry it was long, but
no, but it was very interesting.
Okay. Thank you for the
many things to debate and discuss. ¿Tú quieres que ponga el mío?
close the PowerPoint.
En general, bien inglés me parece más cómodo para dar un debate un poco más rico.
Sí, no tan básico.
Cuando se te reduce todo.
Tenemos media hora para.
Okay, so we have half an hour still, if you want to pose any questions. Adrian, can you hear us? Can you hear the translation? 1, 2, 3. Let's see if you can hear us. 1, 2, 3. Testing English. One.
Las dos traductoras simultáneas son excelentes.
Sí, gracias, muchas gracias.
Son muy buenas. Yo estuve en otros y sé que la gente que usó la traducción simultánea ahora estamos viendo.
Muy bueno.
Sí, se van tornando porque
okay, so let's see.
Sí. Sí, después vamos a subir.
Oh, yes, anyway, this is being recorded, so we are going to upload this. I will need to listen to his presentation like 5 times at least to get the core of it.
A ver, ¿se escucha la traducción?
Okay, let me see if you can you hear the translation, Adrian? Can you hear us? Yeah.
Pero ellas lo estuvieron escuchando y antes se escucha.
Yeah, that's so strange because we could hear, yeah, but can you hear them? No, just 1, 2, 3.
No, claro, pero él.
No.
1, 2, 3, testing.
Él va a tener que meterse en el canal de español para escuchar la traducción en inglés. Porque
No.
de acá. O sea, hay un canal, se van a invertir, pero no hay que tocar nada.
Bueno, me pierdo. Pero el teléfono, si vos... Tienes que ir ahí hacer la traducción. Adrián tiene que conectarse al inglés.
Sí.
Yeah, you should be connecting to the English one. Let's see if you can hear us. 1, 2, 3. I'm just testing to see if you can hear.
A ver, y estamos en el inglés.
We should be here on the English channel. Let's see if you can hear us. 1, 2, 3. Testing English. I'm just speaking to see if you can hear it. Speaking in English. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. Where's the channel? That's the point. Testing English. 1, 2, 3. I will continue checking. Oh, I think the volume was low. Was that it? No. Maybe that was it, that the volume was very low. Okay, I'll continue checking just to see if you can hear us. 1, 2, 3, checking the English channel. If not, And 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I'm speaking in English. 1, 2, 3. I'm checking.
Take this one.
That's fine then. I'll do that.
Solo hacer algo.
Sorry.
1, 2, 3. Just test in English to see if you can hear us. Can you hear Adrian? Can you?
Yes, I
Great,
can.
great, perfect. So I'll let them know so that they can pose the question. Okay, so Caro, would you like to start with any questions or, I don't know, any comments? I do apologize, the mic is very, very low. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for your presentation. Adrian, could you please ask them to move closer to the mic? It's impossible
I tried to move
to hear.
Yeah.
The presentation was very important, and you created this dialogue in my mind about the dialogue among all different elements that we are reflecting upon all the time. So I do thank you for your optimistic view on it. At least at the end, you were quite optimistic. I mean, during your presentation, of course, you were showing elements that show a very crude reality, a very difficult reality. But anyway, I think the last part of your presentation was very interesting, where you invite us to think a bit more about, okay, what would be an optimistic view to the future? And I think that we can contribute from the experiences in our country as well. So I wanted to share something that I was thinking about while listening to you. The capacity of the states to create this idea of good migrants or bad migrants, as like categorized in different levels. We know that a lot because the Argentine state is born like that. When the Argentine state is created, when they created the basis for our national state, it was based on immigration. I mean, the Argentine state promoted specific policies to welcome European immigration. And then we know that, of course, they are coming from different countries, from different parts of the world later on. So when the migrants came, it was a population that was very, positively welcomed because they were expected European workers, professionals, and decades later, these migrants became, I'm trying to be brief here, of course, I'm generalizing things, of course, but these migrants started they started showing different political practices, anarchists, or, what they brought. And that was sometimes the motivations or the reasons why they had to migrate from their original countries to start with. So that's why we can see the first of these capacities of the state to change the view, or maybe let's not say view, let's say categorization of migrants, turning them into good migrants, between inverted commas, of course, because they came from an industry and they brought this progress. And then the other side, the criminalized migrants. And of course, based on that, then all the negative views on that. So now by listening to you, to your presentation, I was wondering, I don't know, maybe this feature, these characteristics, that is characteristic of the Argentine state from the beginning, and that might stay forever because it's kind of embedded, included in us, in the state. So I don't know, throughout, but because of course, then later on, I don't want to talk too much, but of course, we will have different struggles, different moments or eras of migration in Argentina, where, of course, you can see different categories that, of course, respond to different features of migrants, the African migrants, the Asian migrants, the whatever, or Central American migrants more recently. But this capacity of the state, and of course I open up this question, not only my opinion, but like general comments, that might be included, embedded in the migration studies. It has taken us to include this element as part of any analysis that we might want to do for migration here, whether it is a migrant that is considered a good or a bad migrant. There are times in Argentine history that some nationalities were viewed as positive nationalities, while others were negative nationalities. So I think that all of this is very interesting to, well, to go deeper into the analysis or to read more about that, but focusing on the topic or the view that you presented to us. And just one further comment between brackets. For example, I know a bit more about Asian migrants, Japanese, for example. The Japanese that came over to Argentina, and they had this positive prejudice, let's say, because they included or embedded all the positive features of the Asians, while the Chinese or the Koreans did not. So if you analyze the integration processes, they were not so different from the Japanese. But all of a sudden, the Chinese were negative, while the Japanese were still considered to be positive. So I don't know, this might be just a brief summary of why or how come that some categories so close become negative or positive. And then they say that Chinese people do not integrate properly, they don't speak our language, etc. So I don't know, just this comment, or maybe to relate this to the end of your presentation. But we are going to read your book anyway, so we will have more context. But for example, Korean migration and Chinese migration to Argentina took place at a time when the previous migrations had already been more installed, more settled. So the role of the cultural or multicultural dialogue, even if it was very similar, it is different because it came years later, and this way of establishing or settling themselves in the city or getting into the economic system that we had in the country, they became very much in kind of working in a niche, like the Chinese community working in Chinese shops, and that continued in the same areas of the economy, and they became very visible. They were, for example, usually living in the center of the city or in areas that are very competitive from an economic point of view. From a cultural point of view, they were located in specific areas, very competitive to the middle classes, for example. So you might think that that stereotype or that negative categorization was due, and of course I'm just putting everything in one big basket, but that was due to the fact that they didn't comply with our idea of a good citizen coming to a new state. I mean, those were populations that kept their own language, kept their own culture, and that they created their own living, their own lives here with mobility, but creating like their own families here. So I think that there's something very interesting to continue exploring or working on in that sense, because that, I don't know whether to put that as the concept that you mentioned before, positive or negative, dominated subjects or not, because at the end of the day, there are actors as well with specific features. So at a certain point, they are more autonomous also than other mobility groups. And to a certain extent as well, they are more transgressors because they question the rules of the Argentine state as well. So that's it. I've spoken a lot. I've spoken a lot. But so these groups do have a problem when it comes to the categorization of the state, what the state makes of the categorization of these migrants in the current times. And it is difficult to visualize them as desired or non-desired, or wanted or unwanted migrants, like good and bad, as you said before. So yeah, from my perspective, it's difficult to put them apart. So I do believe that it is very interesting, but I insist trying to look at it from the perspective of the Argentine state and how the Argentine state started, like the basis of it. Of course, taking into account the migration policies that came afterwards, closing or opening our borders, being able to build the image of migrants according to the goals of the different administrations or of the different governments throughout history in Argentina. So yeah, that's it. All of this related to the migrant populations in the current times, and we can also maybe also Latin American populations or migrants, Bolivians, for example, in Argentina, they became national actors to the current days. So they might be seen as transgressors as well, because they've been able to move transnationally and create a big culture and capacity. So again, subjects that are dominated or not. But I'm just mentioning a lot of things that came to my mind, but that's it.
I want to mention just a couple of things. They have to do with what we have been discussing with Adrian before, and they are things that we are interested in. The case that you mentioned about Farage, we can also find it here in Argentina in different moments.
Yeah.
We have several Farage in our story, in our history, in different moments, under different governments, where there are certain economic policies that are implemented and that use migrants and construct as migrant subject, just in the way that you described, collectives that are not necessarily migrants. They construct them as migrant subjects. For example, second generation of migrants who are presented or constructed as migrants and criminalized in different ways. So there's something interesting there. And I want to insist that this is not something new, that we can see this throughout history. And of course, it has to be studied more in detail, but I believe that we see a certain modus operandi, a certain way of operating of the Argentine state here.
Briefly.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time, so we'll do like several different comments, and then you can close. The first thing that concerns me, first of all, had to do with what we understand as decolonialization and what does the decolonial turn bring to our discussions. I told Adrian before, it's not the same to think about coloniality or post-coloniality or decoloniality from the global north, from England, than thinking about it from our countries in the south with our own histories and with what migrations bring in relation to this idea of double denial. We have a double alienation as countries supposedly constructed upon the logic of independence, but then do not break with this pattern of coloniality in how they create the nation. They compose themselves looking at an otherness, the European ideal, and upon that they build, they construct their forms of identification that continue to reproduce in a very interesting way with migration, particularly racialized migration, that bring news of the other, the denied native other, and the slave population with a strong colonial component. So there is something that concerns me there, that upsets me a bit. We cannot talk about coloniality from the same starting point, and there is something that we need to tend to there. And the other point, and I want to mention this very quickly, it's great that Sandra is here because she's been discussing this for many years now, but I believe that we need to think about this in a different way. We don't talk about integration processes here in Latin America, we talk about access to rights. And Adrian was saying that that is super normative, and I said, yes, it's normative for European standards, but not for Latin American standards, where there are struggles for the conquest of certain rights that are active, that continue to be active today, and that put people on the streets, that take people to the streets. And we have achieved magnificent things in terms of decriminalization and the development not only of the words that we use. For example, we do not talk about migration illegality. We talk about irregularity, but that was a political struggle. There was a political struggle underlying those concepts. So with Adrian, I have a pending discussion that has to do with, you talk about integration, which is along the paradigm of assimilation. And what Adrian mentioned makes a lot of sense in terms of many things in Europe, but it doesn't make so much sense to us. So there's another discussion that I believe is important there. And then I just want to mention this other thing. This has to do with two things that I find super interesting for our debates. The first thing is that we have been researching migration. And now, when we talk about mobilities, it puts us in a very fun and interesting place. For example, the example that I gave to Natalia, and we discussed with Adrian, the access to a lot of population that left the country as tourists, Bolivian and Paraguayan, the access was restricted to them because they left the country and they were, and the fact that their rights were denied shows that they are constructed as subjects that are not deserving of certain rights. How we understand that the migrant subject does not deserve tourism, does not deserve mobility. And I believe they are working people who only have to work, or that's how they are constructed. Adrian, I think someone, I don't know if it was Adrian or another scholar, talks about subalternized subjects. But this speaks about who deserves mobility. And this brings a very interesting and productive debate. Also, migration policy that does not enable or allow other forms of mobility. Exactly, and these other forms that we are not looking at. So I believe that there is a class issue there that also is at play in migrations and mobilities. And the other thing that I think that MIGMOBS is showing is that while we are discussing and seeing how the system focuses obsessively on migration, at the same time, in mobilities and classification of mobilities, a million things are going on that nobody is looking at. And I believe that these are the things that I would pay attention to. And we have to understand that we are just starting our debates. And I think it's important to mention these things. Maybe if you have questions. I am very grateful for being here. My name is Sandra Gil Araujo. I am a researcher from the CONICET at the University of Córdoba. Before that, I was here in Buenos Aires. I lived many years in Spain, for 20 years. I did my PhD there, and my thesis was about integration, migrants, immigration policies in Catalonia and in Madrid. And I must say that your book about philosophies of integration in France and the UK was a key book for my work, my research. In fact, I talk about the existence of a Catalan policy of integration. And today I was surprised to see integration from the perspective of governmentality, because I mentioned this in my thesis as well. This is something that I came to as well in my thesis. And then I continued to work a bit from afar, because I came back to Argentina in 2011, and I continued to work from a distance on integration, civic integration policies. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello, hello.
Ya, y se pone acá.
Lo seguo, però.
Está allá. No, no, después que se respondió todo, no funciona. Llega uno, vos, all day. I don't know.
Why it stopped? It just stopped.
Yeah. Ahí está, con la mejor.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Sí, viste, te salva. Siempre salva.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Is it
Bueno,
okay?
estaba diciendo que
So,
también
I
sigo,
was
digamos,
saying
a distancia, porque ya
that
yo volví en
from a
el
distance,
2011.
because I came back to
Las
Argentina in
políticas de
2011,
integración
I have been
cívica.
following
Y yo
the civic
coincido
integration
con lo que
policies.
estaba diciendo
And
Ana,
I
que realmente son
agree with
marcos
what Anna was
muy
saying,
distintos.
that these
Y una de
are very
las
different
diferencias creo
frameworks
que
in Europe
el
and here.
planteamiento de
And
la
one of the
integración
differences that I think
tanto
has
en
to
los
do with
discursos, los debates, las
how
políticas de
integration is
integración en el
presented in the
contexto
discussion and
europeo,
debates,
es una
policies of
política de
integration
Estado, digamos, es algo que
are a
viene
state policy.
del
It is
Estado, ¿no?
something
Es un
that
poco
comes from
esta
the state.
pregunta sobre qué se hace con esa población migrante que se pensó
It's
como
a response to the question of what do we do with this
temporal
migrant
y
population
se convirtió
that
parte
was considered
de la
as maybe
población
temporary
de los
first
países
and
a los
turned
que migraron, ¿no?
into
Esto que
part of the
el
population
planteamiento de
of the
Sayad.
countries they
Y
migrated
acá
to. This is
el tema de derechos
Sayad's
viene más bien de abajo, es una
position.
demanda,
And
digamos, me
here,
parece que ahí también hay
the
una
issue of rights
diferencia
is a
importante,
demand
¿no?
that comes from below. And there is an
Pero
important
bueno, tengo
difference as
acá
well
cuestiones
to
que
take into
quería
account.
rescatar
I
sobre
just
esta
wanted
cuestión de
to
integración.
take away
Además,
some things
planteaste
about the
las
notion
políticas de
of
integración como
integration.
políticas,
You talked
yo diría
about
que son
policies of
políticas de control
integration
también,
as control
sobre todo
policies
cuando
as well.
se
I would say that
articulan
they are
con
control
políticas de
policies,
migración
particularly
familiar.
when they articulate with
También que
family
eran políticas de
policies or
selección,
domestic.
y
You
coincido,
also mentioned
entonces
that they
también
are
ahí es como que hay
selection
una
policies, and
diferencia
I agree with
importante en
that.
esto. Y te quería preguntar también en
And I
relación a
wanted
esa
also to
obra, ese
ask
libro
you, in
que creo que
relation
era tu tesis,
to
¿no? Lo de filosofías
that
públicas de
book,
integración en Francia y
Public
en el Reino
Philosophies of
Unido.
Integration.
Sí,
I think it was your
¿te parece
thesis
que
in
todavía
France and in the UK.
existe
Do you
esa
think
diferencia
that
o
that
si ves
difference
como
still
una
exists,
convergencia
or
de
do you
las
see like a
ideas de
convergence
integración en los distintos
of the
países europeos,
integration
¿no?
ideas
Porque
in the different
bueno,
European
esta cuestión del
countries?
idioma o
Because we
este
have the issue
lema
of
en el contexto del
languages
Reino Unido
and
justamente de ganarse el derecho a
this
permanecer,
thing in the UK of
esta
earning the
aparición de
right
las
to stay,
ceremonias de
the
nacionalización que antes no existían y que
ceremonies
se
of
van dando en distintos
citizenship or
países.
nationalization that
Y
didn't
por
exist before
último,
and now can be seen
ahí hay
in different
una dimensión
countries.
que me parece
And
importante,
finally,
Néstor,
there is
que
a
es
dimension
la
that I believe
dimensión
is
de
important here.
género.
It has
Y
to
el
do with
lugar que
the
ocupa
gender
el
dimension
discurso
and the
sobre los
role
derechos de las
of
mujeres
the discourse about women's rights has in the anti-immigration narratives. Fassin is talking about an imperialism of sexual democracy, and I believe that these are important concepts and ideas to think about these technologies of including and excluding, opening and closing.
Key palabra de
Technology.
Sobre las políticas de integración.
De la sexual.
No, Fassin habla del imperialismo de la democracia
talks
sexual.
about imperialism of sexual democracy.
Sexual democracy imperialism.
The name of the author.
Fassin.
Eric Fassin, sí. Que creo que ayuda, sirve para pensar esta dimensión de género de las políticas de integración.
Helps us to think about the gender dimension of integration policies. Now we give you the floor, the mic, Adrian.
Terminamos su trabajo a las 8, pero le vamos a extender un poquito para que Adrián pueda contestar y en todo caso
we're going
bajamos
to
el Zoom, nos quedamos,
give some time to Adrian to respond.
Pero ya bajamos el Zoom cuando Adrián termine de contestar. ¿Oye?
Sí, great. So, thank you for all the, all the reminders about need to change. All the reminders about the importance of context and thinking carefully about the applicability of any of what I'm saying to the South American context. That's at the heart of our thinking and the work we will do. I think with Carolina, what Carolina was inviting me to do was to think of any particular case that we look at in terms of a long history, the long history of nation building and the relationship of migration to it. And immediately your story of Argentina makes me think, well, how do we put this alongside the story of the USA, which has been told? I mean, a great book by Aristide Zolberg, Nation by Design, would be telling quite a lot of the similar things to what you're talking about in terms of how settler colonialism has worked in these countries to produce good and bad migrants. And particularly, and I tell this story in my book, also how this awkward construction of migration in the USA as ethnicity, as different ethnicities mixing into the American nation, completely misses the question of slavery and the black and white divide in the US, which of course works in a different case in the Latin American context. And you also have very significant, the presence of, but different histories of indigenous populations, where of course, I don't think of Argentina as the first place where you're thinking of the pressure now that indigenous thinking is maybe having on some of these standard modes of thinking about migration and minorities. But of course, it's there in all of these countries and needs to be thought about. But I would stress that the point of our work is not, yes, that we have to know the long historical context, but we're really talking about the 1970 to 2020, the era of neoliberalism and changes in classical thinking about migration, which have varied internationally, but which, well, without saying anything about what was going on in Latin America, there has been a really big qualitative change since 1970, which is to do with the emergence of highly mobile populations that are not classified by the state as good or bad, but are seen as invisible. Yeah. That's mobilities. And then you can take any given migrant group and they can move from invisible to good to bad, and I kind of wish, I wish in our study that we're also talking about Paraguayans, because it seems, presence of it's easy to think about, the racialization of a classical migrant group that is a mobile tourist population and gets turned into a racialized migrant group, Bolivians, but maybe that's happening in the same way with Paraguayans, but maybe it's different. Maybe the Paraguayans have a greater margin of maneuver, or if you're Uruguayan, you're probably still invisible. Well, I don't know. I mean, I want to know the story for all of those mobilities and not just the migrants, because that's the point. We need to put the invisible mobilities into the picture and then start thinking about how this is shifting all the time during this period. So, I'm also aware that a lot of Argentines went to Venezuela within this time frame. So the mobility can go in the other direction, and issues to do with exile and asylum and so on. I mean, I think the point about exiled, what's really, of course, interesting about the presence of exiled European populations who bring this particular mix of politics to the country is, I mean, that also happened in the US, but that stuff was very strongly suppressed in the US at a very early stage, left-wing union politics, for example, whereas it's been ever present in the Argentine context and creates a different kind of political dynamic. And political dynamics really matter. I think also in the ability of groups to make claims or use rights. I mean, I wonder, about the argument about, I mean, theoretically, rights have to be the same thing everywhere. There's no point in talking about rights theoretically unless, a right is a construction of theory. It's not it's not something that exists in one continent and not in another. So so of course one can take sociological views of rights, but I'm also pointing to discomfort around the concept of rights because of it's a discomfort to do with the relationship between Marxism and liberalism, and I think that shifts maybe in the Latin American context, where also there's a different debate about populism and mobilization in left-wing politics. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I'm more optimistic than Ana Paula about the compatibility of our views, because I mean it's obviously an accepted argument for me that these visions of integration that are being created by the American and European literatures and the politics of these countries is not applicable to these other countries, where and that's kind of part of the point, is that we need to sort of think back to, but I'm addressing obviously a dominant debate where all of the mainstream scholars, all of the policy is all about immigration and integration, and that's all people talk about. And getting anybody to talk about mig mobs and the sort of theory that we're using here is very difficult. Whereas I think it has a natural, it naturally translates into these scenarios where you have these very ambiguous kinds of statuses of populations between tourism, free movement and economic migration that's just across borders, and abilities of different nationals to move freely, that then states are trying to impose this kind of standard more immigration, territorial nation state thinking, and presumably they use these indexes of integration from Europe, coming out of Europe, as tools for imposing inappropriate state policies that don't reflect at all the bottom-up dynamics. And we're interested in the bottom-up dynamics, and the fluidity is a positive thing maybe that we can work with. And thank you very much for talking a bit about the older integration work, and my work has shifted quite a lot, I think, to try and work more with the Foucauldian ideas, the governmentality that are now very present in lots of critical migration studies. So I should find out more about the lineage of the origins of these ideas you're talking about in terms of your own work as well. yeah, there's been a convergence in standard thinking on integration in Europe. For that, integration was something that was seen as very foreign in the UK, and UK just converged.
Yeah.
When I imposed my frame of integration on British scholarship, it was very confusing for people, because people had nothing to do with integration anymore. That was a long time ago. We finished, but then it came back with nation building in the 2000s and new kind of patriotisms, and then civic integration became this European kind of framework, which is also civic integration goes very closely with also building neoliberal subjectivities, and it also goes, as many people have pointed out, with building positive and negative issues around gendered integration, particularly of Muslim women. So the normative debates around integration that are always projected onto women who are left behind from integration because they're Muslim women at home. So this has been a typical feature of debates in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Germany. And I think that fits, and there's a lot of people working on also the way in which integration uses norms to break up family patterns, and it's a sort of legislated Islamophobia a lot of the time. But I mean, it works very much through women's positions. So that's just some answers, or some points to some of the excellent comments. Thank you.
Si les parece, cortemos el Zoom.
If you agree, we will stop the Zoom transmission. I think there are some further questions or some further comments. So, yeah, Adrian understands quite a lot of Spanish, and we can, Joanna, or we can help with the translation now. So yes, I would just stop the Zoom then. I will finish up the Zoom. I will say thank you to the translators, and we will continue here offline. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
Maravilloso, gracias.
Gracias a todos.
Fíjate ahí antes de cerrar los comentarios. Para que ahí tenemos está Jessica Paola, que bueno. Dulce Castillo she's another assist. Also, she's a master. All the lab, all my lab were here.
Bueno, buena.
Si no, a las traductoras, dispensarlas ya, y en todo caso
una vuelta, que mañana seguimos.
Gracias a todos y todas.